My name is Maya Lin. For as long as I can remember, my family's version of success has been visible and loud. A 2-car driveway, a college diploma framed above the mantle, a blue check of approval that you could point at and say, there, that person made it. I learned to love quiet work the hard way. Early mornings in dim operations rooms, nights stitched together with conference calls across time zones, and a stubborn refusal to tell anyone at home how good things were getting. On paper, I should have been the family's cautionary tale. I didn't own a car. I rode the bus and the subway and learned to time my life by the rush hour schedule. My mother, Linda, had a sharp laugh that did not like ambiguity, and my sister, Erica, had perfected the art of the backhanded compliment that reads like an obituary. Maya doesn't even have a car, they'd say at family dinners, seasoning the sentence with pity and an impressive amount of schadenfreude. They meant it as proof I'd failed at this adulting thing. They didn't realize I'd been busy building something that doesn't fit in a garage. What they saw was a daughter who took the train instead of leasing a luxury sedan, a woman who refused to plaster her life with consumer trophies. What they didn't see, and what I chose, deliberately, to keep hidden, was the company I started on a laptop and 3 sticky notes on a kitchen table that used to belong to my grandmother. That company, Trans Global Aviation, grew in a way that made spreadsheets hum and accountants whisper. It became an international operation. It hired people who sleep in different time zones than my relatives and signed contracts with governments and Fortune 500 outfits. It turned into a transportation empire worth billions, numbers that, when you hear them out loud, strip ordinary conversations of comfort. Keeping it secret wasn't a game. It was armor. I watched my mother and sister treat frugality like a flaw. I cubed their ridicule into a small private vow. If I told them the truth, everything would change. The way they looked at me, the way they measured me, the currency of arguments at our dinner table. Disclosure meant spectacle, and spectacle would have flattened the quiet, complicated reasons I'd chosen this work in the first place. Also, frankly, I was tired of being asked to justify my life in the way people ask about hobbies. So, what do you do? There are stakes beyond pride. My life is built on people, pilots who trust the routes I plan, engineers who argue about tolerances at 2 a.m., customers who book flights because they know the fleet will arrive. My decisions ripple. A route opened here saves a factory job there. A contract secured keeps dozens of families paid. The empire is not just a headline number in my head. It is lives and schedules and the sound of a hangar door closing after a successful test flight. To reduce all of that to Maya doesn't have a car felt like erasing the people who depended on what I had built. Still, the family narrative was loud. At gatherings, my mother's eyes would find my empty driveway like a lighthouse searching for wreckage, and Erica would tell the neighbors in a tone that was equal parts giddy and smug that I prefer public transit. They treated my choices like a personal indictment. It stuck. It stung. It became the small, persistent ache that made me plan things more carefully, not just to succeed, but to be understood on my own terms. So I kept the doors of my life compartmentalized. To my family, I was frugal, private, maybe a little aimless. To my employees, I was exacting and present. To my own conscience, I was both pragmatic and obstinate. That arrangement held, until it didn't. Thanksgiving felt like one long, thin needle of a conversation. Everything pointed at me and poked. The table was the usual battleground. My father, David, carving the turkey with surgical seriousness. My mother, Linda, volleying tiny judgments like garnish. Erica, my sister, smiling with the kind of sharpness that could slice a pie and someone's ego in one go. Cousins milled in and out, bringing gossip like extra dishes. I'd spent the morning pretending to help, basting the bird, refilling the wine, while mentally cataloging every jab because I knew how this would go. They had their script, and they were going to perform it. "You never settle down, Maya," Erica said between bites, the sentence lubricated by cranberry sauce and condescension. "You don't even own a car. Must be nice to live on trains and mystique." Linda laughed in the way she always did when she was about to punish someone with affection. "You're not married, you don't have a mortgage, you don't have a husband to hold the camera. What are you actually doing with your life?" They said it like I'd chosen intentional obscurity as a lifestyle brand. People at the table nodded, the way people nod at a tiny seasonal story they already learned the year before. I smiled. I kept smiling because I'd rehearsed not saying anything. There's a strange discipline to silence when people are practicing humiliation as tradition. At some point, Erica moved on to anecdotes about neighbors who just bought SUVs and how visible success seemed to multiply in their driveway. It was performative. The room loved a tidy, visible narrative. I felt the familiar knot, the one that made me want to explain myself, and then, simultaneously, the one that told me to keep my mouth shut because explanation would have been a performance too. I set my fork down, felt the polished wood of the table, and let my voice come out quieter than they expected. I started a company 8 years ago, I said. The sentence landed like someone opening a window in a stuffy room. You could hear the air move. They blinked. A few people laughed, assuming it was another of my half-jokes. I didn't smile. I said it again. Transglobal Aviation. I founded it 8 years ago. Silence is underappreciated in families. It has its own currency. Linda's laugh lost its edge. Erica tilted her head like a dog trying to hear better. David just stopped carving and looked at me the way you look at a crossword when you finally find the right word. It's an aviation company, I continued, because I wanted them to understand the scale without me yelling numbers. We operate internationally. We have contracts with governments and Fortune 500 companies. We move people and equipment. We manage a fleet and a team of engineers and pilots across the world. The Thanksgiving chatter splintered. Someone started coughing, more to fill the acoustic emptiness than from anything they'd swallowed. Erica's mouth pushed into a narrow line. You mean like charter flights? She asked, the tone attempting casualness and failing. Charters, I said, and cargo and medevac in some places, and logistics where it matters. It's practical, not glamorous. They processed that like an unexpected math problem. Linda's voice, when it came out, was pitched at a vulnerable hope. Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you? Because I didn't want it to become a thing, I interrupted, because I could see where her question was leading. To the showy gestures, the awkward requests, the new measurement system they'd apply to my life. And because what I build isn't a trophy to hold up at the holiday table. It's people's livelihoods and long contracts and decisions that affect others. Once it's public, it stops being mine. David's hands curled around the knife like he was anchoring himself. We thought you were struggling, Maya. We thought. You thought I was struggling, I repeated softer. And that's okay. But you also need to know something else. 3 years ago, when you were talking about selling the house because the bank was breathing down your neck, I bought it. I saved the house from foreclosure. That line had a different effect than the company one. There are small domestic certainties. The idea that your childhood home is anchored by some larger force. And I'd quietly removed that anchor and replaced it with something else. I watched Linda's face change from bafflement to a complicated cocktail of relief, embarrassment, and something like anger at being rescued without being told. You bought it, David said. It wasn't a question of legality. It was a question of why and how and why I hadn't said anything. I bought it to keep you from losing it, I said. And then I leased it back to you at a rate that would make it easier, affordable, no theatrics, just stability. Erica's spoon clattered into her napkin somewhere between indignation and curiosity. So you own our house and you don't have a car, she said. The attempt at mockery was thinner now. It sounded like a woman trying to throw a stone at a moving target and missing. I felt something loosen inside me as they absorbed it. None of this made them instantly reverent. People don't rewrite their private narratives that fast. Linda's gratitude was complicated. She wanted to be grateful, but she also wanted an apology for all the times she judged me. Erica wanted to understand how to monetize this new information into gossip. David, bless him, wanted to go sit down because the idea of complex family finances was making his head hurt. They asked practical questions, the kind you ask until something feels digestible. How could I afford it? Did I help anyone else? Where did I learn all of this? I answered in small, steady beats. I talked about late nights, about hiring smart people, about building slow and reliably. I said nothing about the billions. That claim felt like a circus trick, and I didn't want to do the sideshow. After dinner, while everyone else drifted into the den to watch football and trade old resentments, I stepped outside for air. The cold was sharp and honest. Part of me was tired of hiding, of the quiet resentments, of the way my achievements had been translated into a single condescending line about not owning a car. Another part felt oddly buoyant. I told them. Not all the details, but enough to make the quiet hurt stop being the story and start being a mistake on their part. I didn't leave that night feeling triumphant. I left with plans. The reveal had moved the chess pieces. Now the real game, the one where I decided how to make my truth visible in a way that matched the scale of their assumptions, was beginning. By the time the whump of rotors reached us, it sounded like a slow, angry ocean rolling toward shore. I told myself it was practical, an optics move to close the conversation, but even practicality felt a little delicious. I texted my operations lead a single line, "Do it." He texted back 3 green check marks, and somewhere between a hangar and my parents' cul-de-sac, 3 Sikorsky S-70s started trimming their approach. Neighbors poured into their lawns like they'd been given free tickets to a private air show. Erica grabbed my arm and went hotter than a person has a right to. Linda stood with her hands splayed in the exact way people do when they're trying to hold 2 competing emotions at once. David just planted himself on the porch, jaw slack, as if his face had forgotten how to perform regular expressions. They settled, slow, obedient, enormous, in my parents' backyard. The grass flattened under their skids and the air filled with the scent of jet fuel and cut hay. The rotor wash batted at loose napkins and the faint defeated sound of the TV football game next door. For a heartbeat, the world shrank to the 3 black silhouettes kneeling in our yard, each one worth $13 million. $13 million. Each. Erica's phone was already out. "Maya, tell me those aren't," she started, and I let the pause do the work. "They're Sikorsky S-70s, I said. 3 of them, each valued at about $13 million. Saying the price felt petty and precise, like dropping coins onto a silent scale. People around us did the arithmetic for themselves in stunned little faces. I walked them close enough to the nearest bird to read its markings. My ops manager, Tom, popped the hatch and waved like a man on parade duty. Pilots in company jackets stepped out, faces I'd seen on 6:30 calls and in midnight Slack threads, and for once the team looked less like a roster and more like people. Javier, Neka, Raj. They smiled politely at the family as if family fit anywhere on the org chart. "Why did you do this?" Linda asked, voice small. It was not a resentful question anymore. It was an actual request for comprehension. "Because you kept describing me like I was missing something obvious," I said. "So I brought something obvious to you." I could have named contracts and let that be an abstract waltz. I didn't. I gave them decimals and human scales, the ones that make corporate speak feel like table talk. "We manage 327 aircraft across the company," I said. "We employ over 2,000 people worldwide. Those people aren't a line item. They're households, kids' soccer teams, mortgages, tuition. We fly medevac flights in places where time means life. We move specialists and parts and equipment where airlines can't, and governments need things on time." Faces shifted from shocked to confused to, in some cases, crestfallen, as if the world they'd built for me was coming down in a very adult rearrangement. Erica tried the old angle. "But the house, how could you even?" And I cut her off gently. "You already know about the house. I bought it 3 years ago, so the bank couldn't take it. I lease it back to Mom and Dad at an affordable rate. You still get Thanksgiving, plus a roof." The gratitude on Linda's face was complicated, the same way victory can bruise you when you didn't want it to be a fight. Someone from the cul-de-sac shouted, "Are you buying Amazon next?" And the neighborhood laughter made for a tiny, ridiculous chorus. I let them have it. "We're in conversations about strategic acquisitions," I said. "Big companies look at aviation differently now. Logistics matter more than ever. We're not announcing anything yet, but we're serious about expansion. And we just closed a deal with the Singapore government, $95 million for logistics support and medevac solutions in the region." Saying the figure out loud felt wasteful and revelatory at once, like tossing out a ledger page and watching it catch fire. Erica's bravado cracked. 95 million? She repeated, like tasting salt for the first time. That's... She trailed off, which in Erica speak is a form of surrender. I watched Linda tuck her hands into the pocket of her cardigan as if she needed to hide them from herself. Later, she would say she felt embarrassed for being small-hearted. She said it like an apology and like a measure of growth at the same time. I didn't want any of this to look like a show of wealth for its own sake. The helicopters were loud and impossible and meant to be a visible punctuation mark, not an advertisement. I'd spent years avoiding the blare and the billboard because so much of my work didn't translate into Instagram posts. But there's a private economy of perception in families. Once someone's convinced you're failing, they keep spending that belief like credit. So I made a payment in perception. Neighbors recorded, friends called, cousin Danny tried to sell the moment to his followers. I walked the perimeter of the rotors and met pilots who shook hands with my parents, who asked about the neighborhood and whether the house had enough insulation. They respected Linda's casserole dish as if it were a relic, which in a way it was. When the tea and questions ran down and there was nothing left on the table but plates and a new balance of information, I did something small and theatrical. I opened the clipboard I'd brought, handed it to my father, and said, "David, sign here. I'm putting a flight lesson on your Christmas list." He blinked as if learning to land a helicopter were an absurd fantasy, and then, to my private amusement, he grinned. The backyard had been a stage and the helicopters were the props, but the point wasn't to humiliate anyone. It was to correct the ledger of assumptions, to recontextualize those sly sentences about train mystique into something the family could not ignore. I'd wanted them to see the scale and also the soul of what I'd built. The three S-70s did both. Impossible, practical, and staffed by people who called my name without irony. As the light began to slope toward evening, the pilots walked back to their birds. I climbed into the nearest one, feeling the familiar, rational hum of business logic under my skin. I paused at the hatch and looked back at the porch where Linda, David, and Erica stood like a sculptural trio made of mixed feelings. "Save me a slice," I said, and the line was ridiculous and tender at once. They laughed because they could. The sound was uneven, like a choir learning a new song. I strapped in, engine cycling, and the backyard became smaller. Not because I was leaving, but because the distance between how they'd seen me and who I was had finally begun to close. The helicopter rose with a polite, businesslike thrum. Not a tantrum, not a declaration. Just reliable engineering doing what it has always done. Lift, level, go. From the hatch, I watched the backyard shrink, watched the familiar roofline of my parents' house become a rectangle in a field of winter-browned grass. The neighbors looked small and earnest, like dolls at a tea party. My family stood on the porch, hands clasped in ways that said something like consternation, and something like relief, and something like the beginnings of pride that you don't have to shout to be true. As the rotor wash stilled into distance, my thoughts simplified themselves the way good logic does after a long argument. I hadn't come to Thanksgiving to stage an air show. I hadn't come to bully or to boast. I'd come to recalibrate a story they'd been telling about me. A story that reduced complicated work to conspicuous consumption. If the measure of success at our table had been something you could park in the driveway, then I'd brought a skyful to prove that not everything worth having fits in a garage. In the weeks that followed, the edges of our interactions softened. Mom sent an email, an odd, formal thing, thanking me for the house and saying she was proud, which read like an apology and like a surrender to facts. Dad called to ask about the flight lesson, then texted a photo of himself grinning in a flight helmet, which made me laugh so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. Erica came by one afternoon with a casserole and a long, frank question about what it's actually like to run a company. She asked it because she wanted to understand, not because she wanted to triangulate me into some family scoreboard. That was the real victory, curiosity replacing cheap judgment. At work, the fallout was quieter and more meaningful. Employees who had once worried I was overstressed laughed when they heard about the backyard landing, not at the theatrics, but at how the story finally made sense to the people who had never believed in improbable quiet. Contracts continued, flights launched on schedule, and the day-to-day hum of logistics, the thing I love and the thing that produces the headlines other people chase, kept steady. The helicopters I'd brought home were not a vanity purchase. They were an exclamation point on a sentence that had been misunderstood. People often imagine that proving them wrong requires spectacle, and sometimes it does. Sometimes a helicopter is precisely the punctuation your family needs to stop reading you wrong. But the deeper, longer work isn't in the show. It's in the choices you make before anyone can write you off. Buying back a house, setting an affordable lease, keeping quiet while contracts close in Singapore, building a team that will pick up the phone at 2 a.m. Those are the transactions that accumulate into meaning. They don't make good tabloids, but they make real change. The last thing I did before the hatch closed was press my forehead to the cool metal frame and think about the girls who'd once been told that trains equaled failure. If you teach someone to equate success with parking spaces, they'll never learn to read balance sheets or to understand how saving a hospital's supply chain can be a kind of kindness. If you teach someone to equate value with visibility, they'll miss the steady architecture of care beneath the applause. I flew back to the hangar and to the conferences and to the midnight Slack threads and to the flights that needed planning. I flew with a private satisfaction that didn't need applause, the kind you get when something you built keeps working and keeps helping people. Later, when Mom and Dad celebrated another quiet anniversary in the house I'd saved for them, Erica took the kids to the airport to watch a takeoff and returned quieter and kinder. These were not grand reconciliations. They were minor shifts in how we measured one another. That, I decided, is the last word worth having. The knowledge that you can be rich in ways that don't make good gossip, that success can be a set of obligations you accept gladly, and that sometimes the best revenge is simply living on your own terms, steadily, usefully, and with a little more grace than the people who tried to define you ever showed.